Okay, thanks everyone to join this session as organized by the Data Versioning Interest Group. This session we will discuss translating the data versioning principles into machine actionable recommendations. We have 4 co-chairs of this interest group. Yan Group here with us. Yan is group leader in the mineral resource unit of CSIRO, and Kristen Erga, and she is repository manager at the GFZ Postman, and unfortunately, she is unable to with us today because of her other work commitments. And we have Leslie Wyvern, and Leslie is a geologist and a data strategist at RDA, NCI, and OSCOP. And myself, Mingfang Wu, I'm product manager working for Australia Research Data Commons. Sorry, can I go back? Sorry. So we have a session notes, the link in the Zoom chat. If you can click on that link, put your name, affiliation, that would be great. We will also use these session notes to get your feedbacks on some crucial questions. Will be more on that. If you have any questions or comments, you can add them to the Zoom chat or into the collaborative notes, whichever convenient for you. And here is the agenda for this session. I will give an introduction of the background of this group, what we aim to achieve. Not many people know about this interest group, data versioning interest group. It's good to give a background information. And also, Yan will give introduction about the data versioning principles and why we want to turn these principles into actionable recommendations. Then this is kind of our working session. We use this planning session, use this opportunity to take your input. We provide 6 questions that we think that's crucial to turn that principles into actionable recommendations. So we will ask your input and suggestions to each of these questions. Then we will have a time to discuss the input, your input, then wrap up with actions forward. So I will give introduction to the group. So this group is here for a while now. So the group started in 2016 as we start off a bird of feather session at a plenary 8 to discuss or gather if there are enough interest to start a group. So evidently, so we have lots of interest. Then we start an interest group, and in plenary 9 that at Barcelona. Then through this interest group, we identify things we would want to achieve. Is we want to use a conceptual framework to formalize the language terminology when we discuss about data versioning, and also principles to guide our practice. So when we have that clear goal, we start a working group, because a working group have a short duration, 18 months to produce output. And then at the plenary 14th at Helsinki, we provide the final report on principles, on the 6 principles. We also provide 39 use cases, how people the daily practice on the data versioning. So the principle was derived based on conceptual framework, and Yan will talk soon, and on those use cases. And then we transit the working group into the interest group, aiming to promote the adoptions of the principles. And then through the previous plenary session, and we got feedback say, now we have a principle, but how that guide to our day-to-day practice. So that's the aim of the interest group. Last 2 years, we trying to advance to the data versioning by turning that principles into actionable recommendations. And that's also major theme for today's session. So interest group has a charter. Our charter lists 3 specific goals for the interest group. First, as I just said, we want to promote the data versioning principles, and also develop recommendations, make them principles actionable recommendations. And also this group provide a forum for people come to discuss issues related to data versioning, data republication, mirroring, and reusing data. While we working on those specific goals, then we may result contributions to other RDA groups. If we identify specific goals, we could start a new working group or interest group in general if there is no overlap with existing RDA groups. So here are the 2 outputs from previous working group. One is data principles, and one is the 39 use cases. Yan will talk in detail later. So the session objective, as I said earlier, is a working session. We will discuss about 6 questions that are crucial for turning principle into actionable recommendations. So that was the introduction of the group. If you have any questions or comments, please put that into the chat, Zoom chat. And then next, Jens will give an introduction of the data versioning principles. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ming, for the introduction of the group. And well, looking at the list of people attending the session, I can see some familiar names, but also quite a number of names I don't recognize. So we thought it would be good to give a quick introduction into the data versioning principles, because the data versioning principles are also about defining a terminology that helps us define what we mean when we talk about versions. Often in the way we use the term version, it's very broad. Anything is a version of something else, but what exactly do we mean? And so I quickly want to go through what this group had developed in all those sessions in the past. Next slide, please. So what we did in the working group phase was that we collected 39 use cases from the community about data versioning practices and questions. And then we used the concepts of software versioning as well as the functional requirements for bibliographic records, also known as Ferber, as our conceptual framework. And using the software versioning techniques and Ferber, we developed 6 foundational principles that describe what versions are, and also we introduced the concept of the full path of data from the idea to putting something online on a server for download. And it's also important to recognize that just working with one file and its changes over time is something we still encounter, but it's more often now that we have to deal with whole collections of samples. And the DOI at the bottom of this list of bullet points points you to the paper in the Data Science Journal that we produced as an output of this working group. And we'll put that DOI into the chat as well. Next slide, please. So Ferber is something that has been around for a while, and the librarians don't like it, but we think it's a useful concept to describe how things relate to each other when dealing with data. We did receive feedback at the plenary 20 and at Göteborg that the community thought that the Ferber model was too complex. We did discuss the BibFrame model, which is related and somewhat simpler, but in the end didn't adopt it. We can discuss this maybe later, but I won't go into the details now. As I said, we also used fundamentals of software versioning in our work. But what Ferber is that it's a relational model that relates the item on the shelf in the library or on the drive in the data center to the work. The work is the conceptual idea of doing something, doing an experiment. Or a field campaign. And this idea is expressed in the data product. And both of these levels are still abstract. There's not a file that you can download as the expression. It's a data product, it's an abstract thing, but it's manifested in a specific format. So this is important to recognize that things can have the same content, but in different formats. Say you have a picture that's encoded in JPEG and in PNG. It might be the same picture, but because of the different formats, also the checksum and the bit stream are different. So just naively seeing it from the perspective of does the bit stream differ? They would be different things, but this is exactly the point of developing this terminology. We can say, yes, they are different because they are 2 different manifestations of an expression of a work. And in the end, there's a file on a drive that is an item of this manifestation. Sometimes you can have items across several servers of the same manifestation. And what this helps us is not just being particular about what we mean, but it also helps us give credit to specific actors in this whole value chain. We can credit the researcher, for instance, for their work and creating this data product as an expression of that work. We can also credit the data center for providing access to a specific item. And having this framework in place, we can identify all these elements and develop a framework around how we want to deal with them, what are our best practices. Next slide, please. So the principles that we developed in the working group are listed here. We start at the very base of, is this thing different from another? We identify a change, and we call this revision. That's the term that we took from software development. If there's a change from A to B, we can see a change in the bit stream. We call it revision, and this is quite important in dynamic data versioning, but also in other cases that we will discuss today. And in the way how we produce data products, there will be several revisions until we decide that this change now is significant. And so this is now not just a technical process, but also an editorial process where we release a data set. And we need to communicate the significance of this change in a way that our designated user community understands what this change means. And semantic versioning, something that you all probably know from software, is a way of signifying how things differ. So a major change, a version change from 1 to 2 means that it might not be downward compatible anymore, while from 1.0 to 1.1 will mean there are some changes that are important, but there's still compatibility. And if it's from 1.0.0 to 1.0.1, it signifies that there's just some bug fixing, but it shouldn't break anything. This is one way of expressing the significance of the change, but there are others too. Then another principle that is important nowadays is talking about collections, the granularity of things. How do we identify collections of objects, aggregates of objects, time series? And I've already talked about formats. Things can have the same content semantically, but be manifested in different formats. And then, of course, we also want to talk about derived products, about provenance, and the information about how one object was derived from a precursor object. Next slide, please. So this isn't just an exercise for people who like to be meticulous about words and sorting things. It has repercussions for the way we do science, for instance, about being able to identify authorship, authority, identity, and ethics. With a framework like this, we can identify unambiguously a data set, identify which is the authoritative data set, and in this way also talk about the ethics of sharing of data. And I mentioned that sometimes it's important to identify the data product, the expression. Sometimes you also want to give credit to the data center by being able to identify the item that you've worked with, and also for reproducibility, being able to identify the item is important. There's the whole complex of reproducibility and provenance, and by being able to clearly identify things and being able to talk about their identity helps improve reproducibility and track provenance. And this has then repercussions for data quality when we look at different levels of processing. And then there's also other needs that we can talk about today. Next slide, please. So what we want to develop, and we've been at this for a little while already, is actionable recommendations, because the feedback that we get on the principle is that they're fine, they're helpful, but when somebody asks a question about how do I do this in my practice, often the answer is it depends. And that's not satisfying at all. So we have to get to the point of having a set of best practices where we can say, if you encounter this situation, your options are A or B. That's my idea of what actionable recommendations are, but I'm also curious to hear from you what you think actionable recommendations about data versioning should be. So I think I'll hand back to Ming.
Yep. So as Yan said, the key theme for this session is want to hear from you what the actionable recommendation, you know, when you see those principles. But let's take a step back, and before we get to those questions, do you have any questions about any of those principles?
You can use the chat also to ask questions, or use the raise hand function to make sure that we see you.
I need to enlarge my screen to see if anybody raised a hand.
Yes, Adam.
Hey, hi there, everyone. So Adam Valsmer from JISC in the UK. So been following this for a while. I'm apologies for not being able to get involved until now. The versioning principles are great. And one of the questions we have from the kind of practice and creative communities that we work with are, how do we distinguish between the versions of the work and the kind of progressions and additions to the narrative? So when we're talking about things like objects and collections, one of the things that quite often happens is that over time, a collection grows, but it's still the same collection, but it would have different objects inside it. And sometimes the view of that collection as a thing, as an entity, changes without it necessarily having any change to its content. So there's kind of a tension between kind of like versioning and saying this is a new version, and kind of ensuring that respecting the kind of creative autonomy over that collection itself. And I know that's a fairly tricky one to get started with on kind of like general data versioning, but I just think it's something that we've been struggling with, basically.
I think it's a great question, because the way I would approach this is looking at this maybe as a time series. And in time series data, there's also this tension between the time series having an identity, but then changing all the time, because I'm adding data to this time series. I might be going back into the time series and making corrections to older data. And this is where one of those it depends moments comes up, where I need to ask, what do you want to express through versioning? So you could say every time it changes, you make a snapshot of what it is. a revision, and then at some stage you decide there's a significant change and we want to publish or make it known that there's been a significant change, and we make a release. So that could be an approach to this. What a bit more fundamentally touches on the ship of Theseus paradox. It sounds to me like it might be one of those cases where in the ship of Theseus paradox, Theseus sails across the Mediterranean, and every time he comes back to port, he changes parts of his ship. So over time, the ship consists of all sorts of new parts. Is it still eventually, when it's all replaced by new parts, it's still the ship of Theseus? And the solution that the geographers have come up with for geographic information systems is to look at things as perdurant objects that keep their identity over time, even though they change in shape, content, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And or look at endurant objects that remain unchanged. And then every time Theseus ship changes, the endurant view changes. You can take snapshots of every port call, but as a perdurant object, it stays the ship of Theseus for the entire time.
That's fabulous. Thanks so much for that. We talk about ships and Greek heroes quite a lot in that. So that endurant thing I've actually not come across before. That makes brilliant sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the question. And I think the let me go to forward the slides. So one of questions, one of those questions may be related to your question as well. So in next 30 minutes, so we have listed these 6 questions in the collaborative notes. If you, for each of the questions, if you could write your insight on current practice, your practice or recommendations under each question, or you could read and vote other people's insight or suggestion. Then after these exercises, then we can come back and discuss about the input you provided in the collaborative notes. So if I stop sharing these slides, so this is our collaborative notes. So there are 6 questions as from the slides. And you could pick questions you are familiar with to start write your insight. Then we will, Jens, do we do a question at a time, or?
Well, it's okay if somebody has an idea for a question that we haven't touched yet, but can fill in something. But I think we might go one question at a time, and should I run a timer so that we spend 5 minutes each on each question?
Yeah. Okay. So first question, what considered a new release of dataset and what should be identified? So you could write your current practice, or you think what's the best practice. Then we give 5 minutes to write your suggestion. Then we talk about those.
If you want to think out loud as well, please do.
Yep. or if you have a question about, what's new release of dataset, what does it mean, or whatever question in your mind, you can put your question as we'll start with Q, then list your questions.
If you,
Sorry.
I said, if you like a suggestion that's already there, just add an asterisk against it so you don't have to type the whole thing out again. Or if you think it's, one that's really important to you, just, as I said, put an asterisk, because then we can compile them and work out which ones we need to focus on. Sorry, Jens.
Just as an addition to this first question, this is a lot about your experience with what is a significant change. And significance is something that depends on your user community. They have certain measures or ideas of what is significant. It's not always the volume of the change that is important. It's whether this change is important to the community. So for the history geeks, as an example, there was a dispute in the early Christian church in the 4th century Common Era about the nature of Christ in relation to God. And the two keywords for that were homoousia and homoiousia. The difference between the two words was just an iota, which in the hierarchy of Greek letters is the least important letter. But that one minimal change with the least important letter led to the first schism of the Christian church. So for the user community at the time, this was hugely significant. I would say to most people today, this is just a historical note, and even theologians think like, okay, this is a really specific question. So it's today's user community is mostly not that important anymore. Fascinating to watch all the different ideas appearing on the screen. This is wonderful.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, 25 seconds.
Yeah, 5 minutes up. I'm also timing. Yeah, we just you can keep
Wonderful.
writing into that box. But we pick up those with multiple plus at the end to discuss about that. So so fixing of errors that have been reported by users, that could be new release, and then revision of the whole data set where a new approach has been applied, data cleaning of the original data. Yeah.
But looking at question 2, I think there's a lot of overlap with question 1. Even though we discussed the questions beforehand, we thought The first one would be more technical, the second one more the content question. But let's just continue with the significance question for 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, usually a new release have a significant changes that need to the question too.
Maybe we can move some things in the editorial step later.
Yeah.
If you have any ideas about identification of a new release, you can still add that to question 1.
Yeah, the second part of question 1 is how should be a new release be identified?
A significant change to a dataset can also be the format, because we call this machine actionable because as a human you can recognize when, for instance, column headers change or the order of columns changes, but as a machine you can't. So even though the content stays the same, this change of manifestation is a real deal breaker for a machine.
That's a good question. And someone is writing, how can change significance or size be conveyed to the user? So that's one of those principles about provenance. And this also related question, I think it's in, yeah, question 4, how the provenance expressed and in vision history.
In 20 seconds, we'll jump to question number 3, which I think is the most contentious.
Yeah. So the change we made not only to the data set, but to the metadata as well. So question 3 is, does change in metadata changes the version of the associated data set? Should we
Can I ask-
version metadata? Yeah.
I've got a, well, possibly it's a lack of imagination here, but I have a question. I'm struggling to picture a situation in which the metadata would change and the data set itself would have no changes whatsoever, unless we're talking like a correction to the metadata or something that, like, you know, an author was missed off the list or an incorrect license was applied or something. I'm struggling to picture a scenario in which there'd be a meaningful change to metadata and zero change to the data set that isn't just a correction to the metadata, in which case the latest version of the metadata should always be used, right? The older versions are out of date. But if anyone else has a better imagination, yeah, license change, but then surely you should use the most recent license and not use an older version of the metadata with an older license. Sorry, just looking at Tom's comment in the chat.
Yep. That was exactly my view until very recently, because I always maintain the view that the metadata is the catalog, and changing the library card doesn't change the book on the shelf. Why I changed my view a little bit on this, and I'm open to discussion on whether the metadata should be versioned, is that metadata can become data in their own right. You can start working on and with metadata, especially as machines. And then, but the real point that I see is with information aggregators. So if you have portals that draw from different resources and then format metadata, I think it would sometimes be useful to be able to identify which version of the metadata you're actually looking at.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, the metadata aggregator situation, because yeah, if they've captured metadata at a different time, it might have a different license, it might say something different to the most current version. That makes sense. And
they might have captured a different view. They might have transformed it into something different. Leslie? And
yeah, I was just going to add the other thing too is that there's a lot of talk now about, say, re-curation of metadata. So for example, with the care principles coming in and people putting labels and notices on the data. And so again, another thing is the concept that's come out of Go Fair and the fair machine readability of data about enabling enriched metadata. So we've got all the attributes to make the data set machine discoverable and actionable. And so I guess that's partly why I'm like Yen's starting to waver, because some of the changes that are happening to metadata to make it more machine readable is very substantial. And as we said with the aggregators, they may have got an earlier version of the metadata. And I certainly know, like with NCI, National Computational Infrastructure, their metadata is harvested into Research Data Australia is the aggregator. And we specifically asked the aggregator to, in their metadata, to state what date they had harvested the metadata from our repository.
Yeah, thanks. Leslie, Poro?
Yeah, just a thought, like, for example, we did a lot of work on COVID data, and in the beginning it was more just, but later in the metadata, they also added, for example, the mutations, but it was not in the earlier versions of metadata, but and after analysis, so later the mutation metadata was added. So that could also be something, the data is the same, but the versioning is really important, because for some mutation might be really helpful, but for for the older metadata version, it would not be. So I'm just thinking of a use case where both could be important. So versioning of the metadata is very important, but not in case the data is not changing. So yeah, that's just my $2 of thought.
Thank you, Cora. And I'm looking at the Zoom chat, and Tom have a comment, the implication. Tom, do you want to talk about that?
All I'm saying is the unintended consequences of bumping version numbers are that it implies that a change has happened. And so if you were to couple a version bump with a metadata change, I think it would be interpreted as that the underlying data had changed if you bumped the version number against the data as well. Whereas the opposite is by keeping the version number the same, you're saying no, the metadata changed, but the data did not. And of course, there are other ways of flagging that, you know, checksums not having changed and so on. But I'm just thinking, how would a human interpret this? And I think that they would take it to mean that they, for instance, have to re-download the data set or, you know, take other unintended actions on the back of seeing a new number associated with it or a new, you know, identifier against it. Sorry, that's the other reason not to do it.
No, that yeah, that's good point. It reminded me there is a discussion about, you know, give separate identifier, one to metadata, one to dataset. So this is a kind of use case why we should have separate identifiers to metadata and to data set. If metadata changes, you reflect that in metadata DOI. But if you point to the same data set, then you would know that data set would haven't changed, but metadata changed.
I think that point in particular is entirely ambiguous in the FAIR principles. It's possible to read the guiding principles and say you're supposed to separately identify or singularly identify data and metadata at the same time. Yeah. I'm a fan of separating them as well.
Yeah.
But we're out of time now.
Oh,
But
sorry.
I take the privilege of being a co-chair to also add my 2 cents. And I see that this is not an easy question. And looking at present practice, Figshare, for instance, changes the version number when you change certain metadata elements. But I think this is primarily because it's a self-service repository with not much of an editorial process. So they kind of automated some of things that should normally be a proper editorial process. And so I would agree with Tom's view that metadata and data should be versioned separately, which was part of the data publication metadata and the precursor to DataCite. And I think DataCite version 1 still had metadata versioning in it, and nobody understood what it was, and so it was dropped. But maybe we now have a case for reviving this idea. Anyway, we have to move on to question number 4. And asking how should provenance be expressed in the versioning history? So in software, there's a good tradition of release notes. There's human readable versions of that, but also machine readable versions, say through Provo, Prov, things like that.
There's a range of practices and it's not straightforward. And the interesting kind of crossover, I think, with the trying to do this for data is the consistent tension around differentiating between the effort and the bit stream as well. And this cuts across all of the questions you're asking. What you are pointing to is more than just the resultant data set. You're actually pointing to the input of energy by a group of people, and that feeds into what goes into what's appropriate to capture under provenance, for instance. Was it a purely mechanical change delivered by a tool that transformed the data in a particular way, or were there committees, and were there input of funding, and were there checks and balances, and so on? How do you capture these things? And in the first situation, that kind of that effort is nice and easy to kind of do in a machine actionable way. And in the second case, it's a messy sort of human process. And really what you're identifying is not the bit stream as being different, but rather the fact, or acknowledging the fact, of people putting that input of energy into making something that other people would be interested in. And this is a huge mess in the software world as well, and completely unresolved.
Yeah, I think that's the root of the "it depends" problem. That all the technical questions would be easy to answer. As always, may all your problems be technical. But when it comes to those social dimensions of explaining the significance, who to give credit, acknowledging somebody's creative effort, that becomes much more difficult to capture.
I just add on to Tom's points about how much of a huge mess this is in the software world, that we also, in both software and creative practice, have some difficulties in expressing the group identity. So if we have, for example, a performance where we have like a large choir or something like that, how do you capture the provenance of them whenever they make a particular change? If we have groups of people working on software, and software can sometimes be even forked because different groups have different needs for that. Where do that go in the provenance stream? Where does the kind of that bit of the like socio-technical bit go in as well? Provenance is so horribly messy, which is why history exists as a subject, partly, and archaeology. But also the kind of we have kind of like lots of identifiers and ways of talking about things and processes and practicals, but I'm not sure we've got any consistency. And I think part of the issue is that lots of people have tried to solve this themselves.
Just if I could add something tangential to the group provenance point, I work quite closely with our head of research integrity. I know that she would be very keen to say that if any changes are made, you can't just have sort of some amorphous organization being responsible. You need to have a named person who's accountable for the changes, for the data set. Like there should always be, if we're using a raw ID to say this organization made the change, there should be someone you can contact about it. There should be someone who's held ethically and responsible for the integrity. And the same thing if, like, for example, a data repository takes something down because they find that it's got private information that shouldn't be there or whatever, there should be a named process and a named contact for chasing that up, which is why I think it's really important to have an individual person who can be held accountable, as well as just organizations for any changes or any data sets.
And that also raises the nasty question of how do we deal with algorithms doing things? I would say that you
Well,
would
I
also
mean,
have
yeah.
to find somebody who can be named as responsible for.
Well, this is
Well-
why our sort of author policy at Cambridge is that an algorithm cannot be named as an author of a research article because an algorithm cannot be held responsible. It has to be a human being who ultimately is responsible and accountable.
Okay, fantastic question, fantastic discussion. We have to move on to question number 5.
That's question 5, yeah.
I think the question whether release should be named or numbered, that's entirely up to the community. We see both practices in software where, for instance, Linux releases are named and in other cases things are numbered. There's a wonderful Wikipedia article that discusses naming conventions. There's wonderful idiosyncrasies. But something that we haven't talked about in this interest group or in this working group phase was how does this relate to manifestations and items. Most of the time we talk about the data, the expression of a work as a data product, and then that's the content, and then the content is manifested in different ways and then delivered through an item. So what does this then mean when, for instance, I publish something first as, say, character separated value table, and then in Excel, and then in NetCDF? And if I then change something in the NetCDF, but not in the other ones, what does that mean for name? Do I have to make a new release? Do you make a new release of just that manifestation? Maybe I discovered some formatting error. Has anybody encountered this before and thought about it? Adam.
All right, I come along, start talking. Right, so one of the things that we have across the repository landscape is we have different deposits and things of the same thing. So if we talk about green open access and people putting things in repositories, author accepted manuscripts and stuff, we have not necessarily exactly, but almost exactly the same thing in a number of different institutional repositories. And they may or may not have a DOI, or they may or may not talk to a digital object identifier. They may or may not then also point to the DOI of something that's either upstream or downstream of that particular version. And one of the things that we have been trying to do some work on, people, especially around in DataCite and myself and a couple of others at JISC, is try and figure out how we resolve these different kinds of items that may or may not be versions, because they have a different locale, right? They have a different place, but sometimes they are bit identical because they're just the same file deposited into the same repository, which doesn't necessarily mean they have the same metadata, obviously. But this kind of question is really something around like the agreement across like a set of versioning entities and articles, as well as kind of a policy question as well. And it gets incredibly complicated when you try and either do a retraction or whenever you try and do an update. And because you have these different things, you either need to have some kind of overall sense of how those versions are expressed and how they are linked together in an infrastructure, but also how you discover them in the first place as well. And so partly it's an existential question about what is existence. Thank you. But also partly it's a more really fundamental thing about expressing those kind of versions and how they are kind of noted, not just in like cataloging, but in a consistent way across this kind of space. And I'm coming here more or less to say I'm not sure we've got an answer yet, but it's certainly something from the point of view of machine actionable that's really, really important. That kind of expression and discovery is part of noting how we deal with this particular question indeed.
Would this also touch on the question to be able to identify the authoritative version of an item?
100%.
Oh, yeah. I just add that we had this battle at the NCI. It's a big 20 petabytes public data available, but the data is moved there to NCI so that you can use it on the HPC. So theoretically, it is a copy of a data set that is already somewhere else. But we made the choice to give that a DOI, which is why we use the Ferber model, because the lowest level of that is the item. And why we did that was that with the organizations that had the original copy of the data, unless you signed a service level agreement, that they would let us know when they had updated the data set at the host, right? Or, you know, someone could have had a schmozzle and their data could have been unintentionally changed. And so what we said was that in the interests of open science and reproducibility, this is the version or the item that was at NCI on this date that was used in this scientific publication. So that's why we love that, yeah, fourfold classification of you know, work, expression, manifestation, and item. And that also gets around when people and this really annoys us. This is partly why we started this group, because there are instances where people are web scraping or downloading data sets from open access repositories, putting them into another repository and actually giving them a DOI. And so the important point is the RIGI-DIG data set is identified by its DOI. Oh, yeah, I mean, ultimately you should be able to prove which is the absolute original one and the genuine one. And when we raised it with one group, because they were, you know, copying data and putting it in this other repository and even giving it a new DOI, they were saying, oh, but the researchers should be grateful we're increasing the accessibility of their data set. And we said, well, if you're changing the DOI, how does the researcher get credit for that data set? So it gets into ethics as well.
Yeah, I believe the correct expression for that is cheeky. The thing on top of that's great, thanks, is I'm wondering if part of this is solved by like the upcoming infrastructure of meta identifiers, so things like research object crate, RAID, and things like that, where they're capturing that kind of narrative and allow the kind of like, here is the thing that happened, and we kind of attach stuff along to it, which is similar to kind of these versioning streams. And part of it is around, again, a responsibility for things like the data commons to identify where these practices are occurring. And we need to figure out a way again about that kind of where this thing already exists, and perhaps some machine actionable ways of, pointing to additional provenance, whether it's machine issued or flagged for additional curation action. And that was one of the things, again, going back to this green repository thing, we were working on. We could probably find like, quite a high percentage of these different but the same things. But then the question is how you flag and relate that, and how much of that is about what you decide to describe and how much of that is about how you go about doing that. And yeah, no, it's a fairly complex question, which touches, as you've just said, on all sorts of different things, on the ethics, the use, the ability to trace impact and stuff, right, as well, because a lot of this stuff is in appendices and codicils rather than actually in actual metadata whenever people take and reuse. So there's some of that as well.
So Tom has had his hand up for
We
quite a
have
while.
Tom. Yeah.
Sorry, Tom.
All good, all good. It's all very interesting, and I think we're all sort of circling around the same things. A little mental exercise that I do when I face questions like this is to reflect how the answer would be different according to a typology of different data types. And I'm rather fond of that. Was it an old NSF paper where there was like research data, community collections, and reference data as the three types? But it strikes me that when it comes to identification, when you're talking about what they call research data, which other people, I know Leslie's fond of calling this the long tail. What drives how numbers versioning is done is really actually participation in commodity systems that they're likely to engage in to actually fulfill their purposes. They don't have a lot of power over the way in which the data is captured. It's rather that they have to participate in systems that are going to dictate it for them. Think of Zenodo and how it does versioning, for instance. But when you get to the middle zone, the community collections, that is the zone where people will come together and talk about different ways that are appropriate for versioning within their community practice. And I suspect you would get a kind of blossoming of sets or ways of doing, and that's what we see in the software world, right? Like there are standard ways of approaching versioning, and those models are kind of cast around and people pick them up and drop them or apply them to projects. And then at the big end of town, when you're talking about reference collections, it's interesting. I think versions take on a different function altogether. They're almost like a marketing label, and can start to drift into a zone where, first of all, they don't need to adhere to some rigid standard. The fact of release, for instance, is sort of big news. And you see that in really big pieces of software where they rename the software when the release happens, for instance, there are bits of software where the name is fused with a number, for instance, and this makes identifying the version like awful. And it's because the version is it's more like a marketing label. So again, thinking about it in the data context, I think we also have to think about this dimension of like, well, what kind of data are we actually dealing with? And that will in part drive even how you would approach this.
Yeah, I really like this distinction of the three different repository types or classes. Thanks for reminding me of that. I had forgotten about that. Again, the time pressure is on, and then we still have one question that we want to discuss with you. Question number 6, which is about including versioning information into a data citation. And how would we do that? There's one remark about locator mechanism. What is this?
Sorry, that was
locator
me.
mechanism? Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, this was something that played out in the software world because there were competing identifier mechanisms that were more or less deeply granular in what they were doing. and you kind of hit a problem with that, you know, where it starts to take up multiple lines of the citation. And at any rate, if the function of a citation in a paper is to locate the source of a particular piece of information, it's not always the case that you go right down to specifying, you know, in textual sources, we don't give the letter offset of the paragraph that mentioned the particular piece of information that we were interested in. And there's a tension there in doing citing between, like, do we actually need to be able to retrieve precisely what is being referred to, or do we need to locate the source and give people sufficient amount of information to interrogate that source and retrieve the information on their own? But there's a trade-off, right? Because the more precise you are, the longer the string is that's required to identify that precise version. And citation as a historical practice doesn't have the ability to be that flexible. And it's, you know, also impractical for a person to read a string of letters and numbers and punch it in a printed paper, for instance. So that's the caution that I'm giving.
As a counterexample, there's the common example for canonical path to go to exactly what you said people usually don't do is people quoting from the Bible, where you can usually cite down to verse level, and in the Torah you would be able to cite down to letter level. So there are use cases where this is being done. It's not always that the community requires this, and often it doesn't. But I think what it's also important here is looking at the different use cases now from a data perspective of, do you want to aid reproducibility, then being able to reference the specific item you work with is important. And as a byproduct, it could give credit to the repository hosting that item. Or is it that you want to give credit to the author of this data product, which is few levels above? This is the expression, which is an abstract object.
If I could just like jump in also for a potentially counterexample from the sort of publishing and open research perspective, DORA, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, specifically mentions removing limitations on citation lists because, you know, in a digital world, there's no need for there to be a letter count on citations and things. And, you know, people limiting how many articles they cite and not giving proper credit was seen as a problem. So there are some movements in open research towards removing limits on citations so you can get the exact granularity you need and you can cite everything, you know, the repository and the data creator and all the other people who are involved. So there's some movement towards that. Obviously, some disciplines more than others are resistant to expanding citation lists and moving away from print copies of research. So it sort of depends where you are, but there is sort of that understanding in some areas of open research communities.
So how far are we from this more flexible situation? And is there any point of us making recommendations now that deal with a more limited, more traditional way, or should we push for more flexible and comprehensive citation practices?
I mean, there's the best case with all the information you'd want, and then there's what's realistically achievable, right? So
I think certainly for the work I'm currently involved in, some kind of guidelines that we can point to that frame approaches, and then that you can have discussed with other involved in both the policy and infrastructure would be really helpful. So I think this is really useful stuff, and it's more about being able to add this kind of structure into conversations. So I think I think it's totally worth doing.
My timer says we've run out of time.
Yeah. Come up for
And
the
we have,
questions.
and I think looking at our agenda, looks we have 12 minutes remaining. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So while they're all back in that document, can you go back to the document, please, Mink?
Which document? This one? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So can you keep going down past question 6? We're absolutely thrilled at how many of you have turned up. This is one of our best meetings. On the bottom of page 8, because a lot of you are new, we're not really sure what other RDA groups this is relevant to. We can make a second guess at it, but I was just wondering if you could take time at the bottom of page 8 and just add if you're members of other groups so that we know what other ones this is relevant to. We'd really appreciate your feedback on that. And then the only other question before Jens wraps up is to announce that Kirsten Elgar wants to step down as a chair, and therefore we're interested in 1 or 2 other people that would like to be chairs. And the only specification is that we'd prefer it not to be someone from Australia, because once Kirsten goes, then all 3 of us are from Australia. And they do kind of want you to have people from other continents such as Asia, US, or Europe. So if anyone who's been here, because there's been quite a few of you, would like to Tom Honeyman, what is it with Australia? Well, Tom, you can go and fight the RDA TAB, but or maybe we just sneak it in. But it's just, again, really throwing it out to you. If any of you would like to be a chair of this to take it forward, can you please let us know? So Jens, I guess it's over to you to say now to wrap up and what we're going to do with all this information and what our next
you
steps
already
are.
said a lot of what was what we needed to say, and but I really want to thank everybody for their input into this discussion. This was fantastic, and you've given us a lot of material to work with, personally, I'm on sabbatical at the moment at Humboldt University in Berlin and working with Heinz Pampel at the Institute for Library Sciences and Information Science, working on data versioning. So this will help the group also a project here in Berlin. I think way of doing this is communicating through our mailing list the progress that we're making. And there was just somebody putting something in the chat. Adam, you want to quickly speak about the non-traditional research objects, Bob?
Sure. I'm sorry for the shameless plug. It seems like a lot of the people in this session, we would really value your perspectives and input. So it's 3 BST, 2 UST, UTC, time zones everywhere. In the afternoon session, we are running the first of 2, we are calling them gaggles because we had to come up with a hook. Birds of a feathers on non-traditional, non-textual research outputs objects, and we would really love to have as many people as possible to figure out how we look at this within the context of the RDA. And I think again, a lot of the stuff that we've discussed right here would be great to bring those perspectives along to that. And we're also trying to figure out exactly where we fit within, in the same way that you know, looking at other RDA groups for this. I think we'd really like to reach out across the various communities. So please, if you are not already booked onto something, do come along, or if you are booked, come along to our repeat session, or do it all again.
Yeah, thanks. I also want to take this opportunity to ask you as the group for feedback to the interest group co-chairs. Any kind of feedback. It could be about the content of the work we're doing. It could be about the format. It could be about how you think we could change the way we work together, or things we could prepare for the next RDA. And is there any feedback from the group? Not everybody at once, please. So I think what we'll do is we will send things over the interest group mailing list to keep you updated about the progress. And then the call for sessions for the next plenary can't be that far away. We'll communicate with you what we will do or propose for the next plenary. And yeah, anything else from the co-chairs?
Nothing from me.
No,
It's just
no.
been great to
Great.
get all this feedback.
Yeah, really, thanks for your participation. We, lots of feedback to the questions we gathered. So, yeah, so as Jens said, the proposal for the next plenary is already open. So if you have any suggestions, please either email either of us, co-chairs, or post, or want to post to the group's wiki page. If the new website works, that's would be great to let other members know your ideas. So yeah. So with that, we will keep you informed about the next platform and the progress on that actionable recommendations. With that, and thank you, and yeah, see you soon.
Thank you very much, everybody.
It was great. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
So with that, yes, we talk later, probably across this Zoom now.
Yeah, I made a copy of the chat.
Okay, that's great.
And then
Then copy
I'll say
pasting. Yeah.
see you next time.